Hello, everyone. I'm Shuja Nawaz, welcoming you on behalf of the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council. As part of the Center's New Pakistan initiative, we're exploring many aspects of the Pakistani diaspora experience, as well as their ties to the Pakistani homeland. I'm delighted to welcome today the filmmaker Iram Parveen Bilal, whose new film, I'll Meet You There, is now available on many platforms. The film deals with many important issues. As we all know, each wave of new immigrants to the United States faces a challenge in being accepted by previously settled immigrants and by dominant racial groups. What's more, ethnic, racial, and religious discrimination add to the difficulties of becoming a full and active part of the American experience. Many Pakistani-American immigrants have suffered such discrimination, and many have also struggled to balance their heritage with the customs and mores of their new homeland. So in this newly released and extremely well-received film, I'll Meet You There, Iram dives deeply into both discrimination and cultural baggage issues that a Pakistani-American policeman and his dance-loving daughter face while navigating a post-9/11 America. Based in Chicago, their community comes under the suspicious eye of the FBI, looking for terrorist financing in their community mosque. The drama intensifies as the policeman's visiting an ailing father is swept up in the FBI dragnet. I won't give the game away, so let's just proceed with the conversation. Joining us will be lead actor and producer Farhan Tahir, a well-known Pakistani-American actor who has had many memorable roles in film and television, as well as on the stage. Then we'll turn to Faiza Patel. She is co-director of the New York University Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. We'll also be joined by Hassan Alam, a staff lawyer with the British Columbia Government and Service Employees Union, and very active in his community in protecting immigrant rights. He recently wrote a very powerful editorial article for the Toronto Star on discrimination against Muslim Canadians. Later in the exchange, we will welcome Sangeeta Shrestova, a film critic and scholar who writes on South Asian cinema. She's also the director of research and programs at Civic Paths Group. And Madhia Hussain, special counsel for anti-Muslim bigotry at the well-known anti-discrimination and human rights group, Muslim Advocates. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to our live and online audience. We will welcome your questions and comments in the latter part of our hour, and my colleagues at the South Asia Center will pass your questions on to me to share with the panelists. But let me first start with the filmmaker. Iram, let me start with you. Give us an idea of how this film came about. What were you trying to achieve through it, and to what extent do you think you succeeded?
I think I will start with a succeeding question. It's very difficult, I think, to say, in terms of independent film, just making a film is a big success because it is such a hard and long road. This was the first script I ever wrote actually in film school, like almost close to 14 years ago. And it was shortly 4-5 years after 9/11. And, men of my age at that time, their late teens in college, on the East Coast, they had, there was some of my classmates from high school in Pakistan would tell me that they would have the FBI call their dorm rooms. And, those types of things kind of stayed in my head. And then there was a friend of mine at my undergrad in Caltech, an Iranian friend whose father was picked up from a mosque after Fajr prayers. And after 2 years, the only charges against him were incorrect filing of taxes. And so, such sort of applications of the Patriot Act were in my own experience, and then I became a filmmaker. And I remember this one moment I was at a community event, and it was in full swing of post 9/11, and I saw this gentleman with a big beard and very orthodox Muslim looking gentleman, but he was wearing an LAPD uniform. And I just could not get his face and his sort of image out of my mind. It's like, what is his day-to-day in this climate right now, And so that happened. And then my love for dance and post 9/11 within the Muslim communities, the sort of, born again Islam's, the definition. After 9/11, I felt that there was such a spotlight in the Muslim community, you had to define what type of Muslim you were. Before that, you could just go on being Muslim, being part of, one of your identities. And so a lot of people sort of redefined and tried to figure out, well, what camp of Islam am I in? And during that, I saw this division in my own family, whereby, some of my family who I grew up dancing and listening to music with suddenly thought music was haram, not allowed, and dance was not allowed. And at weddings, we would have to tell when the dancing would begin so that the conservative members of the family would leave. So all of these things were just very interesting to, so I think they just trickled into the script. And then it was so difficult to make this film because frankly, for a very long time, it was very hard to get people to finance a Muslim protagonist who was not a terrorist or in the wrong. And so the script kept changing with the times. And in some ways, I think the so-called success and word of mouth it is receiving is probably because it has come at a point in time when people recognize that Islamophobia really exists. Because even up to 3 years ago, people would say things like, well, something should be wrong in the mosque. I'm not getting the payoff, and I just would be shocked at these responses. But yeah, so I would say that would be a quick summary of the last 14 years of trying to make this film.
Well, tell me about the title, because it's very intriguing. It's a couplet from the celebrated poet Rumi, and let me try reading it, although I'm sure Farhan would do a much better job. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. Can you explain?
Yeah, absolutely. This film had a terrible title for the longest time. It was called Forbidden Steps. And I knew for a very long time I didn't want it to be this title. And Rumi, ironically, Rumi is a big, he plays a big part in my life. I named my daughter Rumi. And now I think about it, my first feature opened with a Rumi quote. So none of this was actually sort of planned in some way. But as we were editing the film, I knew that the title would come. And this, by the way, this quote is on my WhatsApp away message, has been forever. And I was asking for some hive mind, brainstorming, and somebody quoted the entire quote. And I just zoned in on I'll meet you there. And I said, of course, it has to be that. Initially some of the people who've been with the project forever were like, I don't see it. I said, trust me, you will. And I think one of the strongest moments of the film is how the quote comes up in the end. I think so. So I think it's about meeting you there in terms of ideology, in terms of a intergenerational conflict and gap. In terms of every sense, it is about in a world where divisions and, us versus them exists, where can we meet people to actually have a dialogue? And so I think Rumi's quote really reminds us that there are fields where you can meet and discuss.
Well, Rumi sheds a lot of light in a very dark world. Are you an optimist like Rumi yourself?
I think I have to be if I'm going to continue telling stories. I do think I'm an optimist, but I think I'm not an eternal optimist. Like a lot of artists, I go through my ups and downs, but I would say I'm a net optimist. For sure.
Good. Let me ask you about your cast, since we have Farhan here, but other key members are not on the panel. How did you select your cast, and was it easy to find the right fit for the various characters for a primarily English language film?
So again, in Hollywood, or this is kind of made outside the Hollywood system, but cast does everything in terms of financing. So it's always like a catch-22 game. Farhan and I had been sort of flirting together professionally for a while. We wanted to work together. I tried to get him on my first film, but I wasn't good enough for him. So hopefully with this one, I was able to bag him. But, so we were kind of chatting back and forth. But again, it was one of those things where, the producers, agents, and it was like I could attach, could not attach. So there was this whole cat and mouse game. But, Muhammad Qavi Khan, who's a legend from Pakistan, he is somebody, I was very particular that the grandfather and the diction of the language, the film had to be authentic. I really get drawn out of films when the accents are incorrect or the language is incorrect. And in this particular film, I think the use of language is also such a big delineation of identity and the phrase, I'll meet you there. Because when Farhan, the son, decides to speak and meet his father in Urdu, there's a very distinct sort of shift in intention and relationship. So it had to come from the homeland. And so finding, and Kavi uncle convincing him, and then on an independent budget, bringing him here and hoping that the timing, like his visa literally came through 5 weeks before we were about to shoot. And then Nikita Tiwani, who's a delight, who plays Farhan's daughter, was found by our casting directors, who I have to give a shout out, Meg Morman and Sunday Bowling. So they found Nitin, and then Sheetal I knew. So the casting directors found the rest. But I would say that the main key players were people I knew, apart from Nikita. And lastly, I think the actors are everything. They make this film. And as a director, I really do direct because of actors, because it's just phenomenally magical to see them be vulnerable on screen and help us understand human emotions and conflict.
That comes through extremely well. Let me, I think, use that as an opening to move to Farhan and ask him. You've played a wide variety of characters on film, on TV, and on the stage. What made this character different for you, and how did you approach the part?
I think one of the biggest attractions for me with this script was how honest it was, and how it was sometimes, even when people from our part of the world write stories, we sometimes tend to write the same story over and over again, which does not take anything away from the story. But yet, there are other stories that we should share, because our experiences now are so diverse. We have been, as a diaspora, we've been part of, let's say, even the US now for a very long time, and we are pretty much in every walk of life. Although in the media, certain walks of life are more prominent as far as we are concerned, and others are not being paid attention to. And one of the things that I think the movie captures, and that Iram has done so beautifully, is create a story which is non-judgmental, which actually gives the respect to the audience to make their own inferences of where they stand and how they look at themselves in the mirror. And that, to me, was the biggest attraction, because this particular story, in many ways, is very close to my own biography, my own life. And sometimes we might feel all of that, but might have no avenue to actually, honestly, if for no other reason, to dive into it, to grow as a person. And given everything, this film, what it does is that it brings a different experience, which is already part of our lives, but yet it's not being addressed or discussed. So on that level, what I loved was that it was an honest story. And although Iram always says that it's all about the actors, but the actors can do nothing if the word on the page does not support it. You know, I mean, you can have whatever, you can have a classic, you can do Greek tragedies, you can do Shakespeare, but unless I can trust the word on the page, I can't do anything. So that credit goes to Iram to create a story which is multifaceted and yet extremely true and honest, and brings about this idea of, again, I'll meet you there in a different sense, is that we can all coexist. And there is a place where we can voice our concerns, our opinions, our point of views, and not get into the whole realm of judgment. That's where real growth happens, because a lot of the times what we do, and what this world has become, is that we don't have dialogues anymore. We have monologues. I can think of something, and while you're giving your point of view, I'm not listening to you. I'm already thinking of my rebuttal to that particular point. And so nobody listens. And I think this movie and content like this can encourage people to find a safe space where we can all voice our concerns. No one should be vilified. No one should be aggrandized. Nobody should be demonized. We just need to be humanized. And I think this particular film is a really great step in that direction.
Well, I think Iram was very lucky to have an actor who understood not just the part, but the whole film as well as you did and conveyed it. Let me ask you about the stereotypes that normally inform selection of Pakistani-American or Indian-American actors and actresses for television or movies. How do you break out of that stereotype? Because it was clear that none of those stereotypes played a role in this movie. The accents were real. They weren't the exaggerated Hollywood accents. And you yourself have been put in some stereotypical roles in previous performances. So how was that achieved, do you think?
Well, it's something that, as quote unquote ethnic actor, you deal with on a daily basis. There is a built-in responsibility that comes with it, which other actors who might not have this issue of race or less of it don't have to do. And I'll give you an example. If actor A, who let's say is a Caucasian American, if he plays 4 bad roles and then plays a good role, he gets an Oscar. If I play 4 bad roles, then I am thought of as a person who does, stereotypical evil Muslim characters, right? So the playing field is not even to begin. And on top of that, I think one of the things that I take responsibility for is that knowing the fact that we have that ethnic responsibility or cultural responsibility, how do you navigate your career or in that particular setting? So what happens? Sometimes there are roles that come your way, which is true. And I always tell other people that, not all work is good work. I don't need to take everything. I'd much rather go and work in McDonald's if it comes to a point where I'm doing something where my values are being compromised. Now, having said that, the other responsibility that comes your way is that, let's see that there is a stereotypical role. Now, if somebody else does it, it'll become the stereotypical role. How do you, as an actor, find something which can humanize that role? Again, I won't go on and on, but something that I say often is that nobody gets up in the morning and twirls his mustache and says, aha, I'm going to be evil today, right? It's all about, even as a character or in life, it's about the justifications that a character brings to the act that they're about to commit. And that's the chilling part. That's even when you look at, dangerous people in real life, you can see that in their eyes. Anyway, so having said, if that's the matrix, then I need to also find that, okay, these are the things that where this character finds his actions to be justified because that's how they're written. But what are the vulnerabilities of this character? Because if you're creating a fully human being, there might be moments or there might be cracks which show you that he's human, and that makes even the audience identify with the character. So in my case, what I try to do is, first of all, if I do 2 or 3 or 4 bad evil characters, even if it's a hit in the wallet, I will switch it and do something else, because that responsibility of how to navigate my career falls on me. And therefore, it becomes a very delicate dance of how you keep your values intact, and yet also try to do something where you're not being reactionary, that, oh, that's stereotypical. Okay, that is stereotypical. What can I do to make it less? Or is there a situation, opportunity for me to have that conversation with the content makers? That maybe in this one, we might not be able to achieve that. But if I put that germ or that question in their mind, maybe next time when they write or they create, they might think of those aspects that they might not have. So it's a very delicate balance that we have to keep.
Well, you achieved it in the way you conveyed the role of the policeman father, of the female lead, especially when you had to choose between loyalty to your adopted homeland, America, and loyalty to your family and to your Pakistani origins. Can you talk a little bit about that, the conflict, the internal conflicts that you were trying to portray through your acting?
Those conflicts are not just limited to the film. I mean, I think those are the conflicts that I have also dealt with. Maybe not as an FBI agent, informing the activities of a mosque, But those conflicts and those issues do come up because we are people, whether we like it or not. We are people who are orbiting two different suns, is the way I look. And for me, both of those realities have given me enough to become the person that I am. So when you start to look at those things, there are conflicts. There are conflicts because of I've lived my life in this part of the world, but my origins are from Pakistan. Those conflicts are going to come in. So the way I looked at it was that how do I translate those feelings that I've had in those conflicts, which might have been personal, and use that feeling to make the base of how to act or react in the situation that Majid, the character in the movie, might react. So I think that honestly comes from drawing from personal experiences, and also comes from the facility that Iram's script provides you to marry those two, and try to find something that's honest, and that is not being pushed or being looked at from a predictable way of reacting to these situations.
And it's a very convincing performance. Let me move on to Faiza. You've made it your business, Faiza, to expose and to fight discrimination and racism in American society. How did you see this film as a means of fighting bigotry and suspicion of new immigrants?
Well, I mean, I think like everybody else, I think it's wonderful to have a multiplicity of portrayals of Muslims, and I think it's particularly great to see one coming from a woman filmmaker who I think has a different perspective. I was just pleased that it wasn't another movie about the brown guy who couldn't, marry the white girl of his dreams kind of story. So I really like that, and I like the fact that it took on the tension that Pakistani-Americans and Muslim Americans face, but then also kind of grounded in a reality of the informant situation, which is something that we have seen play out multiple times. I've never seen it with a policeman, I'll tell you that, but we've certainly seen this story of the police trying to recruit informants to go into mosques, generally to just kind of report on what people are saying and doing, without even the kind of specific predicate that was theoretically present in this film. So that rang very true to me. So I think and to be able to kind of highlight that in the course of the story, make it integral to the story, I thought was really helpful for people to kind of understand how this actually works.
Well, of course, in New York, we had the famous case of the NYPD trying to recruit people to spy on their mosques, which was a celebrated case. But there were other landmarks too, especially among police forces that are dominated by mainly white immigrants. So can you talk a little bit about the US Supreme Court decision on the case of Tanzim versus Tanvir? Just explain briefly what that was. This was a case that was launched by Ramzi Qasim and others at City University of New York, if I remember correctly, and they won. And the end result was that police were forbidden from doing this kind of work. Now, whether they actually will follow that or not is a different matter. But bring us up to date on what happened.
Yeah, so that case is actually about the no-fly list case, right? Yeah. So, when you have lots of different ways in which the government targets people who it thinks are potential terrorists. One of the ways that they do it is that they have watch lists. There's a 1 million-person watch list called the Terrorist Screening Database, which has 1 million names on it. Several thousand of them are Americans, but the vast majority are foreigners. And then a subset of that list is what's called the no-fly list, which means that even if you're an American, you can't board a plane if your name is on that list. And there's been a series of cases around both the watch listing and then the no-fly list in particular. The first one was back, I think, in the early 2000s, involved a Malaysian student at Stanford who had gone back home and wasn't allowed to come back. That was the first one. That was Ibrahim versus Latif. There was a second one in that area as well, filed by the ACLU. But what the most recent case that Ramzi did brought was interesting for is the remedy it sought. So the earlier cases basically said, well, sure, the government can put you on a no-fly list, but it needs to have certain procedural protections in place so that if you've been put on there by mistake and you're an American, they can, you have a way to get off that. And a lot of people were on that list without good reason. But that doesn't fully solve the problem because it's a really important thing, but it's a procedural fix at the end of the day. What was innovative about this case was that they tried to hold the individual agents responsible for having placed them wrongly on this list and being able to pursue a claim of money damages against the individual agents, which has a great incentivizing effect, because if people can be held personally responsible, then they will hopefully be a little more careful when they decide to put the next Muhammad or Ali on the no-fly list.
Yes.
By the way, I want to interject, Shuja, that I've been put on these lists and I've had to, apply for a redress number when I sent my
trip,
for renewal. And then I also wanted to just quickly weigh in that we shot the film. It's set in Chicago, but it was shot in New York. And I had to go to 14 mosques before I was able to convince a single mosque to shoot in the film.
Mm-hmm.
For the film. And the primary reason was exactly just a fear of sort of surveillance, media journalism from the post 9/11 era.
Yeah.
So it was kind of ironic because I was trying to explain to them, well, this is a film trying to showcase that, but of course, why would they, sort of trust? It was better just to bar.
And they had obviously felt the pressure from the NYPD in an earlier period. But as Faiza was saying, one big result of this was that the FBI agents could now be sued by the person with whose religious freedom they interfered. Let me see if there's something similar going on north of the border, and we bring in Hassan Alam. Hassan, has Canada been immune to racism and biases, or is it more of the same, especially against the Muslim community? And how did this emerge in Canadian society, and what has been done to fight it?
Shuja, I really like the language that you've used there, because I think it points to the fact that, many people think that Canada is this friendlier version of the US in the north that's free from discrimination and, surveillancing, and it's a great place to escape to if Trump ever gets elected again in the United States. But I think contrary to what people think, racial and religious discrimination do exist in Canada and have always existed. And Islamophobia has been a part of that experience. And, for Muslims in particular, post 9/11, Canada's involvement in the so-called war on terror, both abroad, but also here domestically, prompted the buildup of our security regime, and the buildup of those laws and the justification of those laws was done literally on the bodies of Muslims, right? Muslim bodies were the testing grounds for these laws, and we passed legislation comparable to that of the Patriot Act, and again, their constitutionality was questioned by the highest courts of our land, and many of them were struck down. And we saw unfortunate incidents here in Canada. There's many. I'll name one of Mahar Arar, a Syrian Canadian who was deported to Syria to be tortured and interrogated in collaboration with our own intelligence agency, right? Our intelligence agency was reprimanded for that by our courts. And so, names like Mahar Arar became and have become household names in the Muslim community, and examples of what could happen to us and can happen to us if we act too Muslim, if we look too Muslim, or we spoke too Muslim, right? And due to this sort of expanded and unchecked powers of our security intelligence agency, there was a chilling effect in our community, and it continues to happen. People are scared to speak up about these issues. I think there's still fear about sometimes going to mosques here, because there might be, a secret agent such as the character of Majid placed within our mosque spying on us. I can speak from my own experience growing up here. I remember my parents literally begging me with tears in their eyes to not get involved with student politics. I was growing up post 9/11, or to get involved with my local Muslim Student Association at campus because of the fear that CSIS, our equivalent of the FBI, would come knocking on our door. And, I didn't heed that advice. I went on and just became the president of my MSA, and CSIS did come knocking on my door. And simply because of the fact that I was a Muslim and I was speaking out, and they asked ridiculous questions such as, is anyone on your campus praying too much? Has anyone traveled to Pakistan recently? Which literally captures the whole club, right? And so again, for me, this had a chilling effect on me because it terrified me that this is the criteria of what a bad Muslim is. And I think this movie does a great job of highlighting the sort of dichotomy that we need to fit into as Muslims here in Canada and the US. We need to either define ourselves as good Muslims, Muslims who fit into the model minority sort of construct. We keep our head down, we work hard, and we don't question anything, and we integrate. And when asked, we go and spy on each other. Or do we fit into the bad Muslim construct, which is the Muslim that actually questions, these systems of surveillancing, who actually speak up for their rights, and who are unapologetic for their identity. And I think now in Canada, although there has been a shift away from focusing on the Muslim community, and the rhetoric has sort of died down in light of the fact that now people are talking about, Black Lives Matters, the rise in hate crimes against the East Asian community in light of the pandemic. This is a moment for, I think, us as a community to draw those connections now between our own experience of discrimination and the discrimination which, the Black community, the East Asian community has always experienced, but now it's just being highlighted because those are the same systems, right, that have operated to always police, surveillance, and, detain communities of color. So I think this movie opened up a great space for that sort of dialogue.
Hassan, it's very interesting. Some time ago, we did a program on Ambassador Syed Hussain, who was an Indian Muslim freedom fighter. And he came to America to help the Indian community in North America, in Canada and the United States fight for their rights, because there were apparently parallel laws enacted in the United States and in Canada forbidding people of Indian origin from coming to these countries. The maximum that was finally allowed was 100 people in the United States a year could immigrate into America. But Canada had this awful situation where they had a law that said you could not come to Canada unless you came on a direct flight or ship without touching any port. So this was kind of their bureaucratic way of dealing with it. And there was a famous case of a ship that some Punjabis from then British India rented or bought in Hong Kong.
Yes.
Exactly, and they brought it to Vancouver and they weren't allowed to dock. And then the troops were sent on board and they got beaten up by the Punjabis. So it was a fascinating story.
All Punjabis.
Yes, for those of us who were on that earlier discussion. But let me ask Hassan, what is the advice you give to new immigrants? And related to that, is there much movement in the entry of Muslims into police and security forces, as well as the legal profession? You're a lawyer. Are people telling their sons and daughters to go into these professions?
Well, I mean, that's a complicated question. I think it depends on the sort of approach that you take to dealing with this issue of discrimination. I think there's certainly one camp where they're like, yes, we need to fight it from the inside. We need to encourage people to go into law enforcement, to go into even, intelligence agencies, in order to make sure that the people who are doing the policing, look like the communities that are being policed, right? But I think on the other hand, there's people who say, and I'd probably fall into that camp if I had kids. I'd say, no, we cannot uphold these structures and these institutions until there's meaningful change, right? Because to be involved in them and to work for them is also giving a sort of de facto pledge of allegiance, and you're legitimizing them, right? You're saying that these are okay, that these are good institutions. And so I fall into the camp of, no, we need, our role as a community is to, maybe become lawyers so we can sue these agencies and bring about change, such as FISA has done in the America through her work, right? And so I think that's sort of the two camps that are here. There's certainly the model minority camp who say, yeah, let's go into it, and maybe there's a safe in between there, and I don't know what that is. And with respect to the advice that I would give to new immigrants, I think I think it differs, right? Like my parents' generation was a generation that came here to this foreign land where the culture was foreign, the language was foreign. They were cut off from their community. And the approach at that point was put your head down, work hard, and try to make a better future for your children. And just fit in, right? I think the advice that I would give to new immigrants is know your rights, know your liberties, and exercise them. And you don't have to prove your loyalty, right? Because if we're talking about the history of both America and Canada, we're all immigrants here, right? The only people who actually have a right to be here are the indigenous stewards of these lands.
That's a good point.
Yeah, if I can say something, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. How do you navigate yourself? And I think one of the things that I keep reminding myself is combative versus constructive. Now what Hassan is saying, that's a constructive way of dealing with these issues. Sometimes I think, which I think that happens to me also, is that there is a reactionary response to these things. And I think if we want to change things, we need to at some point go beyond the reactionary response and be a little bit more strategic as to how to engage people in conversations. Because when you get combative, walls go up, nobody listens to each other. So how do you find that without compromising your identity or your values? No, and I think the key is, as Hassan said, to know your rights, not just be reactionary, but after you've had the reaction, find and have the energy and the focus to know your rights and combat these things with facts rather than just conjecture or just emotion.
Good point.
If I could just jump in on that as well. I mean, I think that actually there's room for lots of different strategies. And realistically, you need to have a flank that's really, I'm going to say left for no reason, but just a flank that's really, very vocal, very aggressive, and is really taking very strong positions to really kind of shift the Overton window, right? I mean, just as we saw with Black Lives Matter, those were not new issues. Those were issues that the African-American community had been complaining about for years. Nobody paid attention, right? Then you have a movement that's radical, that's on the streets, that harnessing grassroots power. And all of a sudden, the conversation, not the policies yet, but the conversation at least changes. Mm-hmm. So I think, you need that. You also need the people on the inside, who are trying to make things better on the inside. And you need to be able to talk to them because people on the inside need allies on the outside, and that's us, right? So I kind of feel like there have to be multiple strategies working at the same time. And I think realistically, that's, most of the time it works that way.
Never underestimate the passion. I just wanted to say that the two camps that Hassan was talking about also in some very sort of distant way are also generational, right? I mean, I feel like the reactionary, the passionate is the Gen Z crowd. I mean, even I feel like a little sometimes, I'm too conservative for that. But I've seen it, but I'm very grateful for that. It has pushed me on the edge. And I will say that is the reason this film existed, by the way. In some ways, Trump was a silver lining. When I went to an LAX protest on the Muslim ban, and I was having such a hard time getting this funded in the traditional means. And honestly, I was scared. I didn't feel that there would be a crowd there to chant for Muslims like there was a crowd for, Black Lives Matter. I honestly was scared. And the reason I went is just to give more, sort of be more bodies there. And honestly, what I saw just shook me. I mean, the LAX terminal was just, vibrating, and people had, let them in. We're all Muslims. And I was shocked. I never thought on the streets of America there would be so much support for Muslims. And that is the cue when I said, you have to make this film. Because otherwise I was not getting those messages.
The same thing happened at Dulles Airport. And we had many of our white American politician friends who went straight to the airport to join the Muslims in protesting. Let me bring it back to you, to the film, Iram. I want to come back to you because the film has so many layers that it makes it really a rich banquet. And one of the layers is dance. Your lead character loves dance. And I'm sure you know Rumi well. There's a poem by Rumi, and without murdering it, let me recite it briefly. Dance when you're broken open. Dance if you've torn the bandage off. Dance in the middle of the fighting. Dance in your blood. Dance when you're perfectly free. How did dance help you tell this story?
Multiple reasons. Dance is my first passion, and I, in a very sort of middle class, not very sort of liberal Pakistani society, it was not even, I could never dream to become a dancer, you know. So those comments that, you know, like Kathak is a dance of whores, or I mean, these are coming from lived experiences, right? It was just not something I could ever think would happen. I knew maybe 2 women in my entire time growing up that I, not like, you know, actual like Nighat Chaudhary and stuff, but 2 women who were actually learning dance. So I think there was that part of it, which I always, you know, I traveled around the world after my undergrad trying to ask people why they dance. It was part of the Watson Fellowship. And I said, body movement is so integral, you know, rhythm is so integral to human life, whether it's our heartbeat. How could this be taboo? So there was that question and that philosophy. But then honestly, I think that, and then there was what happened to dance in the sort of post 9/11 born again Islam that I was witnessing in my family, right? So there was the initial taboo on a society level. Then there was the whole no music and dance. And I'm just like, wow, you know, so I had my own questions. And again, learning to understand and hear and not really say what is right and wrong. And then on a subliminal level, it's a metaphor because we're all dancing between identities. We're dancing between generations. We're dancing between ideologies. We're dancing between nations. And so in that context of Rumi, it was that. And then I also feel that there's this sort of freedom that is so visual when you watch someone dance that I had a feeling. And that opening sequence of the Jamaat and her at home, always, there were 40 drafts of the script and that never changed. And it looks exactly how I wanted it to look. So that's why dance.
Perfect. Now let me move to a couple of people that have been waiting patiently and get their comments and questions in, but at the same time remind the audience out there that this is also a time for you to get your thoughts together and send in your questions. And my colleagues at the South Asia Center will send them on to me, and I will try and get to as many of them as possible in the time that we have left. So first, as promised, let me solicit a brief comment on the film from our film critic, Sangeeta. Now, Sangeeta, are you in Prague or are you on the West Coast?
I am still in Los Angeles till next week.
Okay. So
we'll be getting on a plane.
I don't have to say dobro večer.
No, not yet. Still okay. Hello.
So let me ask you for a comment on the film from a critical point of view, from where you sit.
I don't know. I mean, this is a bizarre kind of ask in a sense, but I think I'm going to kind of just, and it's actually, I was going to ask you about the dance, but you took my question away. So I'm going to move it in a slightly different direction. Because that is actually how Iram and I met, was through a mutual love of dance years ago. So I'm really glad that it's come full circle for you in that sense. So watching this film, I actually wanted to push this in a different direction. So not in the context of just thinking about it as a film, but thinking about it as a medium. Thinking about it as a medium that encourages dialogue and change, possibly. And I am kind of harking back to a 2-year study I did on with American Muslim youth here in Los Angeles, where I was specifically looking at the way that they were using media that they had access to, so bottom-up media, social media forms, to express themselves, to negotiate their identities, and to kind of just be out there. And the title I had of that report, which came out some years ago, it was Between Storytelling and Surveillance. And I pointed to the ways in which these youth, so they were between 15 to 25, were building what I called precarious publics. It's publics that are negotiating pressures, intergenerational pressures, faith-based pressures, but also are constantly politicized in a post 9/11 United States. So in a way, everything you do is political, even if you just want to live your life, right? As Bassam Tariq said, politics always enters in for American Muslim youth and probably other people, other generations as well. So watching your film, I was really struck by the way in which, I think this has been pointed out, but the ways in which it didn't have a top-down narrative in some way. Of course, it had a narrative, but it had many ways in to the narrative. You could think about, I think it was somebody in here today that pointed, Farhan was talking about the ways that you could enter in through different ways and it wasn't telling you what to think, which to me kind of modeled the ways in which the youth that I was working with were trying to tell their own stories and kind of negotiate and have a lot of conversation through circulation, right? And so I guess my question, if I may ask a question, I know it's more of a comment in the sense that this was really interesting to me because the film invited conversation, right? It invites kind of a debate. It doesn't tell us it's kind of like, this is how you feel at the end of it. Instead, I'm invited to understand each one of the characters or most of the main characters, how they feel. And I guess in a way, I'm curious how much that idea of encouraging discussion and debate and thinking that as an integral way of how you think about change or the impact that the film has, and how much of that was part of your thinking. I know that you're making the film, so most of it probably went to making the film, but like in kind of sneaking that in, like, was that part of the plan at all for you?
I think in a subconscious way, you could say that, because the reality is that I became a filmmaker to better understand the human condition. So I like to write characters that I don't understand fully. Mm-hmm. So in that journey, they help me understand themselves a little bit and perhaps a little more about the world. So I think the reason there's so many ways in is because for me also, I don't necessarily have answers. And the older I get, the more questions I have and the less I have answers. And so that was, I think, and then it was always a goal to not villainize anyone. And I actually feel like I could have done a better job with the Caucasian police people in the film. But, you know, I feel that especially like when people say they love Baba the most, that's the most charming and endearing comment, I feel, because, you know, you would think that, okay, he's like the antagonist. So I would say I think it reflects my own questions. I don't think the world is black and white.
Yeah, that's clear. And I guess sort of as a final piece, kind of bringing it back to the dance, to me, and I think you kind of pointed to that, the dance, the spaces that you create through dance, the sort of breathing spaces in the narrative allow us as the viewer to also kind of process that so that we always feel, and even for the Farhan character, the name is slipping my mind right now, but when he's running or when he's kind of, you know, the moments when there's actually no speaking, but we get to see embodiment, to me is really an interesting invitation for us to feel the characters and to experience their perspectives.
Thank you. Let me move on to Madhya and ask her, because Muslim Advocates has been doing a great deal of work in confronting biases and discrimination in America. In light of the case that is portrayed by this film, what are some of the ways in which Muslim Advocates has fought the seemingly systemic racism and biases that exist?
Thank you so much for that question. And, you know, I think I first want to say that I really appreciated how this film sort of covers a lot of these different topics in a way that I think presents through the perspective of not just, you know, a South Asian Muslim family, but also through the profession of Farhan's role as the police officer. And actually that was something that really stuck out to me, is that, you know, we, in this context of work that we do when it comes to holding law enforcement agencies accountable and ensuring that civil rights and civil liberties of American Muslims are protected, which is at the forefront of the core of the work that we're doing at Muslim Advocates. There's also, I think, something that was really unique or interesting about how you portrayed in the film. There's the idea of an FBI informant is something that many of us have heard about. It's an unfortunate reality that I think the American Muslim community has faced. But it was, I don't know if you intentionally did this, Iram, but it really stuck out to me that there was the reason for him going into the mosque was because there was, government suspicion of activities taking place there, albeit probably unfounded and unwarranted. But there was so much suspicion of him from within the mosque. And I think we all know that exists, but it was really unique because he was perceived as one of their own, but almost like, did he go to the other side? Is he really, who is he, where are his loyalties, and who is he working for, and who is he with, and who is he aligned with? And I think that presents a really interesting dilemma, which, one of the questions that you asked, Shuja, really points to that. Is very much in the work that we do at Muslim Advocates, we often, talk about how Muslims are part of the very fabric of American society. We are the doctors and the lawyers and the police officers and the teachers and the so on and so forth. But I think there is hesitation about what that presence should really look like, and how do we ensure that there's diversity in representation across the board, but also make sure that we're not amplifying injustices and biases that already exist within the systems. And I think everything that you all have talked about today really touches on that. So I would just love to sort of pose a small question to Iram. And you touched on it a little bit, that you saw a police officer and it sort of, you couldn't get that that image out of your mind. But is that what motivated it? Like, as opposed to having a white convert pose as the FBI informant or something like that? I would just love to hear a little bit more about it. But thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for asking that question. I was going to say that, I think the suspicion of law enforcement, I think that the experience of law enforcement is so different depending on what community you come from in this country. So just an example, on my street, this sheriff car keeps driving by, which has been really bothering me for the past 2 weeks. And there's this sweet Caucasian lady who walks her dog every morning. And she was chatting with the gentleman, and he left. And I said, do you know what's going on? She's like, oh, I don't know, but it just makes me feel safe that he does these rounds. And I just thought for a second, I said, how interesting, because that is the complete opposite visceral reaction I had. And I just thought, so much, this is lived experience right there. So for me, I didn't even for a sec, to me, it was obvious that these people would question a cop coming into the masjid, or they would just feel uncomfortable, or they would just probably not say their usual things or talk about, Habib Bhai or Bilal Bhai or whoever, so that was part of the reason. And it just, honestly, I'll be very honest, Madhya, I didn't think about the convert angle, like you were saying. When I saw this in the height of the Patriot Act, if you see, a man with his beard and a Muslim prayer hat, cap in a uniform, and when things were so sort of crude and not nuanced and still aren't, it just imagine the day this person has. It's kind of akin to, sort of Mexican or Mexican-American, ICE patrol agents currently. It's what are they going through? These are very complex issues. Nothing is just binary. So I think that is why that is what preempted. But yeah, I just wanted to share the anecdote of the sheriff car, and now this person just said, oh, it makes me safe.
Thank you, Iram. Let me go quickly with a question from the audience for Faiza. And the question is, how has the reshaping of the US judiciary under Trump affected your work and prospects for positive change for Muslim Americans and other religious minorities? If you could give us a brief reply, then we'll be able to stay within our time. Thank you.
Sure. Trump, as others have noted, clearly brought the issue of anti-Muslim sentiment really to the forefront of a lot of people's understanding of the United States, and sort of wove it into the fabric of racial discrimination that we all understand so well. So in that sense, I think it has been helpful. The difficulty always happens, right? You had Bush, everybody hated him, everyone was riled up against him. Then Obama came and everyone's like, oh, everything will be fine. And then 8 years later, it wasn't fine, right? It was still terrible. But people's attention span flew away. So I think now we have another opportunity to make sure that people's attention stays on the critical issues and not just the obvious ones like the Muslim ban, which the president, got rid of on day one, but the more deeper structural issues that we really need to get to.
Thank you. Now, there was another question that I would normally have posed, but that will open up a fresh debate, and that deals with how people of Muslim or South Asian origin could actually look at their background as an asset in joining the police force or joining, becoming lawyers or becoming members of security organizations and so on. I'm not sure we'll be able to resolve it, but just to go back to another comment we got from someone in the audience, that culture is sort of the software of the mind, and repeating something that was said by one of our panelists, that you have to be in there, you have to know your rights. I think Faiza was the one who said that, and you have to fight for your rights. I think that is the nub of the experience of people like Faiza, people like Muslim advocates and others who are protecting the community. But let me go back to Iram and see if we can wrap this up. Iram, two quick questions. One, what took an engineer to become a filmmaker? And I know you've been asked this before, including by my friend Scott Simon. And the next question is, what's the next film? And can you share anything about it?
So I think it's kind of embedded in the question you didn't want to ask, which is I feel that Muslims need to be in all professions. And I think that media and image and storytelling, I just felt that it's not even just about Muslim, like it's Pakistan. I just felt that people like me were not seen and not heard. And so I just wanted to tell stories. So that is why I think there's other engineers and doctors doing just great work. And then my next film, inshallah, is a film that is about a social media star, and it's about social media trolling and how women can reclaim public space and online space. It's to be shot in Lahore, inshallah, next year. It's called Bakri, which is Punjabi for one of a kind. And I have a couple of television projects which I'm trying to get off the ground.
Well, we wish you luck, and I want to thank all of you for joining us, for making this really exciting and all too short an hour. And on behalf of the South Asia Center and on behalf of the director, Irfan Nuruddin, and our team, I also want to thank our audience for joining in. We will be posting a link to this recorded program, so do let your friends and relatives know and spread the word, because the more people get to understand these issues in this very important film and watch the film, I think the more others will emulate what Iram has done so beautifully. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.